everybody. Welcome to a Friday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have a returning guest for you. His name is Bob Greenberger, and he is an editor and a writer, and he is back on the Bandits talking about his new Kickstarter, which is called Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2025. It is the fourth such project under that banner, and it is a pulp anthology magazine, or really a book, but what used to be called kind of a magazine of stories from talent all over the comic book and prose writing world. People like our past guest, Paul Kupperberg, Elliot S. Magan, as well as those we have not had the chance to talk to, people like Christopher Priest, Dan Abnett, and Jeff Marriott. So let's get to it. Let's hear all about it. This is Bob Greenberger. Bob, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Mike. I'm glad you used the word thrilled.
We're always thrilled to have a returning guest, especially a editorial luminary such as yourself.
Hey, you had your time there too.
That's true. That's true. There is a signed copy of a Howard the Duck Essentials that my friend has. So yeah, I did get one or two credits there. Anyway, today we are not talking about that. We're talking about your latest Kickstarter, which is the fourth in a pulp anthology series called Thrilling Adventure Yarns. So this is Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2025, which is when presumably the book is going to come out. But before we get to, presumably, hopefully, I'm sure it will. Before we get to the 2025 edition, I'd love to know how the entire sort of series came about.
So since 2011, I've been part of Crazy 8 Press, which is a digital hub for a variety of independent writers. We come together, support each other. We figured if we brought all of our audiences to the same place, they would discover other writers of similar interests. And every year we're all trying to do books, and given my schedule, I've never been able to do a full novel for Crazy 8, so I've always been involved in anthologies. And when I was brainstorming what I could be doing a few years ago, I came up with the idea of one styled after the pulp magazines, which I discovered when I was about 12 and thought they were the coolest things. Once I discovered that's where the Shadow and Doc Savage and all these other characters came from. So I said, let me do this tribute, and everybody glommed on and thought it was great. And I kickstarted it with a fairly modest goal, and it did 248% of goal. So it was I was able to add stuff to it, including interior illustrations, and it was a huge success. So I decided to come back and do more.
Awesome. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into your experience with pulp magazines, because there are some who don't quite understand the concept or don't know where this came from. And these were so influential and spawned everything from, new comic books to new prose novels to movies such as like Indiana Jones is sort of pulpy.
Absolutely. So, all right, let me put my historian's hat on.
Yeah.
Going all the way back to the late 1800s when cheap publishing became possible and profitable, people were putting out these magazines. Some were full size, some were digest size, featuring characters like Nick Carter. And there were other recurring characters, and others were just anthologies of stories about the West or about sea battles or whatever. And they were like, a dime for 120 pages. And, you read them on the wagon train or the locomotive when you were getting from point A to point B, threw them out or left them behind, and people read them. They were coming out fairly regularly. I think Condé Nast was the publisher behind it originally. And as we moved into the 1900s, they started getting slick covers, and more publishers were jumping on, Street and Smith in particular. And then all of a sudden you had, adventure stories, war stories, westerns, romances. Some were like All Story. So in 1912, All Story Weekly published Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan for the first time. So, it was an important fertile ground for characters to seep into the pop culture consciousness. Street and Smith sponsored a radio program of dramatizations of the stories from their detective magazines, and their host was this mysterious voice known as the Shadow. And people started going to the newsstand going, I want that Shadow magazine. And the news dealers weren't sure what were being asked for. And Street and Smith heard about this and said, we need a Shadow magazine. And they got Maxwell Grant under the pen name Walter Gibson to reverse it. Walter B. Gibson under the pen name Maxwell Grant started writing Shadow novels, and Lester Dent did Doc Savage. And then you had G8 and the Spider, and character after character were getting their own magazines or appearing in other magazines. Weird Tales, of course, gave us great writers like Robert E. Howard and August Derleth and H.P. Lovecraft. That's certainly where Howard introduced Conan and Kull and Bran McMorn and his characters. It was such a fertile ground. Harry Donenfeld had his own line of magazines that had the term spicy detective stories, spicy adventure stories. And so they were a little risque for the day. And he took those profits and rolled them into what became National Periodical Publications, aka DC Comics. So the pulps was a training ground for publishers and for editors. Some of the earliest comic book editors came from the pulp field. Julie Schwartz, Morton Weisinger, and it was an incredible, publishing thing where things like The Shadow were coming out twice a month. There were something of like 250 different titles a year, and at its peak in the 30s. Started to drift away in the 40s, and then by the 50s, they were really down to just science fiction detectives, while television became predominant and people were watching that instead of reading. So, these days you still have, Asimov's and Analog, and Ellery Queen, I think, is still being published. So there was still a handful of, the last vestiges of the pulp field still being published.
Did they always take the format of a magazine or a periodical, or were they books as well?
I believe there were paper. There were probably hardcover compilations of some of the best of those stories. I mean, I would have to do a little more research rather than give you an off-the-cuff answer. But yeah, some of that stuff did get collected. Certainly, the Conan stuff didn't get collected till the 1950s, I believe, from Grove Press. I don't think book collections really didn't happen until maybe the late 40s or 50s, when paperbacks became the thing.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's thank you for taking us back there. I'm sure I'm not the only listener that probably has a little bit of a hole in my pop culture knowledge, and it's always interesting to hear where, especially as a comic book podcast, because these really were the predecessors to comic books, right?
Sure. Some of the magazines by the 30s actually had some graphic stories, including some of Bob Kane's earliest work.
Oh, very cool.
So, they had great illustrators, but they also had some graphic stories in them. And again, a lot of those creators moved from the pulps, writing for the pulps, to writing for comics.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about this latest edition of Thrilling Adventure Yarns, which includes some of our past guests as writers. So Paul Kupperberg, Elliot S. Magan. I always want to say the exclamation point in somewhere, S. Magan, as well as others from the comic book world, including Christopher Priest, Dan Abnett, Jeff Marriott. How do you get these talented individuals to contribute to these books?
Most of my contributors over the 4 books have come from personal contact or recommendations from some of the other writers. So when I wanted more female writers for my first 2 volumes, Mary Fan put me in touch with a number of people, and I was able to branch out from there. After each volume, and I decide I want to do another one, I do a wish list, and I aim big. Start with like
Sure.
the Kevin J. Andersons and Max Allan Collinses of the world, and work my way through people I'm more likely to get. But one of the lessons I learned as a comic book editor is they can't say no unless you ask. And you never know if someone's got a hole in their schedule, or they liked what they read in the previous volume and said, this looks like fun, or I could fit it in. So, I always ask. And, it's sort of like I start with a large group and it winnows down to I've got my 15, 18 writers. And, I try and bring in new names each time. For this volume, in addition to a number of the Crazy Eight authors back again, every other outside writer is brand new to the series, which is, for me, a nice way to shake things up a little, possibly reach out to different audiences, followers of the writers like William F. Wu or Win Scott Eckert. You never know.
And are there, when you're looking for these writers and it's finally time to put together the anthology, do you have parameters for what the stories should be or can be? Or is it really, the hard work is finding the right writers and then, you let them go to town?
I generally give them first dibs on telling me, all right, you're in, what genre are you interested in? And some have a burning desire to write a sword and sorcery story or a science fiction story. Others are like, well, what do you need? And I look at what people have signed up for and I go, I can use a Western. I can use a war story. After the second volume, I pulled my backers from the first two books and I said, what do you want more of? What do you want less of? And based on that, I eliminated some of the genre topics, so it's a little more focused. I had a heavy amount of sword and sorcery in the last book because that's really what people wanted. This time around, it's a pretty even mix of science fiction, sword and sorcery, and detective fiction with some supernatural.
And when you get these submissions, finally, what is that experience like? Are you, is it, do you have a, picture in your mind when they pitch to you and then the actual submission is, somewhat different or surprising to you? Are they all surprising to you? How does that, what is that like?
Okay, so let's say somebody says, I'm doing a sword and sorcery story. They'll send me either, the log line to give me some idea what they're talking about, or I get a couple of paragraphs. Some give me much more detailed outlines. And the more detailed the outline, the closer it resembles the final story. Other times, if I get just a couple of paragraphs, and once they start writing it, they have to fill in gaps. They have to change things because it wasn't holding together, which is all part of the creative process. I can't say I'm exactly surprised. I'm always pleased when they arrive. In fact, just before we started this, Charles Ardai, who is the publisher of Hard Case Crimes, being published by Titan Books, just submitted his detective story.
Nice. That's great. I mean, it must be if not surprised, but just sort of a great feeling to get the actual story and to read through it and be like, wow, this is made manifest.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when they do surprise me with a turn of phrase or a character I didn't anticipate or a twist. And I got to say, I appreciate the faith they have in the project by actually writing the story before I know I'm funded or not. So there's that too. That's very gratifying. And it's just a pleasure to read them because I know they're going to be fun. And I'm already in my mind as I read the story, go, well, who can I get to illustrate it if I reach that stretch goal,
Yeah, that's super. So a lot of these pulp magazines and just pulp stories used to be very much serialized. And I'm wondering whether there were any stories in the past or even in the one you're doing now that sort of yearned for sequels or, ongoing kind of serialization.
Some of the characters that have been introduced in the first 3 volumes, there's been a couple that have made return appearances, such as Aaron Rosenberg's Liberty Bell. She was a pirate and had a dual identity like the Scarlet Pimpernel. He did 2 stories with her and then loved the character so much he took the 2 stories and expanded on them, turning into a full novel that Crazy 8 published last year. Some of the writers said they'd like to do another story with their character down the road if I continue this series. Because they are standalone and because each book has to fund itself, I don't want to serialize anything. I don't want to have a cliffhanger that I can't deliver on. But if they create a character and they want to bring it back, I'd be open.
Okay. And I think I know the answer to this, another sort of what if question, which is, would there ever be a possibility of doing a version of this in comic format? Of course, you have the huge issue of, getting all of the art for these stories. But I'm wondering if you've ever thought of that.
Honestly, I haven't. What I've been thinking, what I really would like to try is raising enough money one day to do audio versions, maybe with multiple readers. Comics version, that's a new one though. I mean, that surprising given our backgrounds. I hadn't thought of this earlier.
Yeah, I mean,
anything's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. These type of stories, at least the genres that I'm seeing and that you've mentioned, sort of maybe lend themselves obviously to a more visual storytelling. But I actually had not thought of the sort of voice acting kind of thing, which is what happened, I think, when the pulp started coming out, is the radio dramas, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the pulp started first, and once radio started in the late 19 teens, all of a sudden, radio dramas were the thing, right through the 50s.
Yeah, that would be cool. I mean, we would love to see it. We would love to see it in all different formats. One thing that I think is really interesting, and I'd love to have your take on, is anthology series, anthology storytelling itself. And what it seems to kind of come and go. There are times when it's very, our culture is very into obviously serialized storytelling and just being in the one story. And then there are times when it's like we want to get a sort of chock full of diversity of, shorter tales and things like that. What do you think? Do you think it would proceed like that? Or what is your, I guess, pitch or interest in sort of anthology kind of stories and that format?
Growing up reading comics in the 1960s, we certainly had the 80-page giants, which were anthologies of the reprint stories. So I grew up on anthologies. I really liked them. I thought the Golden Age comics, like, Action, Detective All-Star with 6, 8, 10 stories per issue were great. Because if you didn't like one, you turn the page and there's something new. Comics anthologies starting in the 70s proved not to sell as well as character-led full-length stories, which is why publishers try time and again to do good anthologies, and they never seem to last long. And in prose, the market changes so that in the 80s, there were a lot of anthologies, not so much in the 90s, and we seem to be kind of back to where anthologies are okay now.
Yeah. I mean, I like them. I kind of like a mix, and I'm glad that there are anthologies that are still around. I do like sort of getting deeper into one particular story, but it makes sense. I mean, I like sort of the, again, diversity of tales and being able to jump from one to another, depending on, your likes and dislikes.
They break down to 2 types. You get the best of the year in whatever the genre is, or the works of a single author collected. Then there are the themed anthologies, and that's the type of stuff Martin Greenberg and then Gardner Dozois really perfected. So you had like Warriors, which was this big fat collection of stories about warriors, and Gardner was, fortunate enough to bring in some real big guns on a lot of his books in the last 20 years or so. So in my own way, I aspire to that, although I can't afford the big guns he can.
One day. There's always time, I like to say. So that would be cool in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a project like many others that is on Kickstarter. You've done, the three. Is it the three previous or four?
I've done the three previous. This is the fourth.
Yeah.
Crazy 8 Press's various authors. We've all been moving more to the Kickstarter model because it makes sure the book gets funded. Both the writer and hopefully the editor, if there's an editor involved, get paid.
Mm-hmm.
And it also guarantees us an audience that we can slowly build, I hope, and so that they come back and see my book, or they'll see Mary Fan's book or Russ Colchamiro's, and grow from there.
That's great. So we've talked with a number of creators that are using Kickstarter, and there are the pros that you mentioned, and also there are challenges and certain things. What has been your experience personally with Kickstarter? I mean, obviously it includes more exposure, and there's a way to sort of get funding before the project is complete. Do you see any challenges and things that you've tweaked now that this is your, fourth project?
I did more pre-planning for the marketing, coming up with graphics that my cover artist, Jeff Hayes, helped me put together. And that gave me and the authors something to push, something to, sprinkle. So we had a week of teasing. Then the campaign launched on Friday the 19th, and I had a different set of ads for that. And hopefully when I fund and hit the stretch goals, I'll be able to roll out additional graphics. It's getting the word out, and it's getting all of my authors to get the word out with regularity, so that every Kickstarter has a strong opening and a strong ending in theory. It's the middle where it feels like it's a slog, and you wonder, oh my God, I only did $100 today. I'm dying. And then it picks up again. You just have to maintain the enthusiasm and just try and get more websites and podcasts and social media places to talk about it. It will really help if the velocity on this sustains, making it to Kickstarter's Projects We Love list, because that always seems to give it a boost.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it's playing the game.
Yeah, for sure. It's always from what I hear, a lot more work than it may seem to the people that are just viewing and backing the projects. There's a lot going on behind these campaigns that one may not see, that it becomes a job in and of itself.
It can be, and it can be very daunting. And thankfully, Kickstarter and Indiegogo and BackerKit, all these other crowdfunding sites, they all have their own guides and how-tos, and people can learn. And then people talk to each other. I mean, more and more conventions will have a crowdfunding panel where people can share their expertise and learn from one another, which has been great.
Awesome. Yep, that is great. So as we somewhat come to a close here, I'd love to know, what have I missed? Is there anything else you'd like to say about the Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2025?
I mean, if I brought in a number of comic veterans, because I know there's an audience there who like Elliot Maggin and Christopher Priest and Jeff Marriott and Paul Kupperberg and Dan Abnett. That's one segment, but they also have their own prose followings. It's great to see them stretch in different ways and write about stuff that excites them. And hopefully it's a chance for people who may not be familiar with a Liz Braswell, who's got a big YA following with her Disney Twisted Tales series, to see another side of her as an author.
Yeah,
so
that is very cool.
I'm trying here, and again, if I get to the stretch goal, I always like finding good artists, some of whom are comic book veterans. They've been very supportive of doing me the favor of working cheap. And now that I'm teaching at the Maryland Institute College of Art, I'm hoping to rope in a couple of the alumni who have graduated my course, strut their stuff in print.
Sounds good. Sounds like you
Yeah.
have a pipeline of future talent to tap
If
into.
I can get there, I'd love to showcase them.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, Bob, beyond this Kickstarter, even though we want to keep the central focus on it, what else is going on for you? Anything we can look forward to in the near future?
From Inside Editions, November 5th will be Superman: The Definitive History, a slipcased hardcover, oversized, 400 plus pages with foldouts and tip-ins and cool gadgets, not gadgets, but images, celebrating Superman from, birth to today. And Ed Gross started writing it, and I was brought in to help him out. And I think it's a really good, encompassing history of Superman in print and media. And, from what I've seen of it, it's going to be gorgeous and worth the exorbitant price.
And we're back. So what did you guys think of that episode? I really enjoyed talking to Bob, and he is just a class act, and I like his Kickstarters. I like the pulp of it all. We get to hear a little bit about the history of these pulp anthologies, and I wish him all the luck in the world. You guys should go out and back that Kickstarter. Once again, it's called Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2025. After the year it will be published. Go get his other books, and support Bob. He's really putting some great work out into the world, and we like to see it and read it and cover it. So that'll do it for this week's episodes of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening. Thank you for viewing if you're on YouTube. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing, doing all that great stuff to support this program. We have plenty more interviews to come, so keep it dialed in, and we will see you next issue.